when all of a sudden his son just stops. His eyes roll back and they are completely black. This is exactly what happened to the Laurel family. In tonight's episode, we're going to dive into a classified case of a missing family surrounded in conspiracy and the supernatural. This story revolves around the Laurel family, name changed for obvious reasons. The Laurel family, back in the 1980s where the story takes place, had found a beautiful 3-2 home south of San Antonio by about 30 or so miles. The home was a gorgeous ranch-style home and had about 5 or so acres of land surrounding it. While the land surrounding it was more than adequate enough for farm life, horses, and livestock, the Laurels weren't really into having livestock, so for them, it was just extra land for them to get to enjoy. The Laurels were a small, average American, middle-class family. You had Dennis, the father, whom was a real estate broker at the time, and his wife Sheila, who ran an in-home bakery out of the house. Their kids were roughly high school, middle school age, about 12 and 14, his son being the oldest. While the immediate area around the house was around 5 acres, the area surrounding those 5 acres were a mixture of dense woods, open meadows, and rolling hills with ravines and hills that would go on for miles past that. This portion of land was pretty undeveloped and untamed, and there wasn't a whole lot of exploration. In fact, the entire area was just pretty rural and out in the countryside, which made it perfect for the Laurels to get away and relax in their new home. There were practically no neighbors nearby, and Dennis had scored the house for very, very cheap, unusually cheap, even for having the inside deals as a broker. He was skeptical at first. Having been built in the 1950s, he figured there might be foundational damage or there was something seriously wrong, but upon inspection before moving in, everything looked great. I mean, there was even hardly any cosmetic damage or things that needed to be reworked, so the family moved in almost immediately. After a few weeks of settling in, unpacking boxes, and just getting adjusted to a new way of life, the Laurel family was getting quite comfortable and used to their new life already. Until one afternoon, when they received a knock on the door, which they thought was strange considering there were no visible neighbors in the adjacent area. However, Sheila and Dennis both opened the door to be greeted by an older native man, who was very kind and polite, introduced himself as Luke, and asked if he can come in and have a cup of coffee or have some tea, and he would like to chat. Dennis and Sheila mainly just looked at each other, not really sure what to think of him being so forward with his request, but they figured why not. He seemed pretty harmless and was very kind, so they said absolutely, come on in, come sit down, we'll make you a cup of coffee, we'll sit and chit-chat. They figured maybe it was just a friendly old neighbor who didn't really know anybody or didn't have anybody to talk to. You know how old, lonely people get. After a few moments of small talk, they began to grow more and more confused about who this man is, considering he seems to know a lot about the Laurels family and their past. And Dennis is beginning to grow concerned when the conversation turns from just casual small talk to very blunt and serious. Listen, this house, this land that it's on, belongs to me and my people. I want you to do me a favor and either sell it to me or move out of it. Shocked by this stranger's bold request, Dennis politely informed Luke that he actually had purchased the property outright and even held the deed, and the deal was done at this point. I mean, they were in it and they were paying a mortgage on it. However, that answer was not good enough for Luke, as he informed Dennis that the house was somehow illegally built without his people's permission, and begins to tell him about the protectors that reside on the property and the adjacent land all around it, the 5 acres and the 30 acres respectively. And Luke warns Dennis and Sheila right there to their face, saying that if you don't want to sell the house or move out, that's fine, but know that these spirits will come in and try to take their land back. You don't have a choice in the matter. They're gonna do what they're gonna do. Dennis, growing all the more angry as Luke is explaining this, politely asks Luke to leave because he thinks he's either trying to scam them or do something. I mean, why would you have a stranger come to your house, act polite, and be very forward, tell you what he's already told them, and then end it with, hey, you need to leave your house because these spirits are gonna come and overtake your house? I mean, how would you even react to that? Dennis was going to have no part to play, so he tells Luke, you got to take a hike, get out now. Luke quietly and politely gets up from the table, nods at Dennis, steps out the door, but as he gets down the last step, he turns back and looks at Dennis right in the eyes and says, don't come calling me if they come for your family. Keeps the stare, turns back and walks off. Dennis is completely unsure of what to make of the strange visit or the strange man Luke, and does not want to be contacting him again. However, they look on the coffee table where Luke had been sitting, and he left his card. Weird that he would have his number on it, and at the title for his occupation, he put healer. Puzzled and confused and off-put by this strange encounter with this older man named Luke, he just takes his card, figures he must have forgot it, and just throws it in a drawer, completely forgetting about it. Why he didn't throw it away, we're not too sure. It's now been about 3 weeks since Luke's strange visit to the Laurels, and they have quickly forgotten all about it. In fact, they're busy unpacking and still getting adjusted to their new house, which they are loving. Sheila, Dennis's wife, her in-home bakery business seems to be exploding with all sorts of new clientele from around town. His son and daughter are also making new friends at school, and they genuinely seem to be more happy. So, on this night, Dennis figures he'd go outside on the porch and relax. Have a small glass of scotch on the rocks, have a cigarette, and just watch the sunset and get lost in thought. So he's out there, smoking away, and movement catches his eye, because he sees that off in the distance, way over that way, he sees a couple of figures coming out of the trees. The movement that he's seeing is clearly not an animal, but people. But he can't make out any discernible features or anything specific, but just notices that there's about 5, 6, or 7 of these people coming out of the woodline coming towards the house. Now he's watching these people, who just look like black blobs from where he's at, coming towards in the direction of his house. And immediately he feels like he's in danger because he doesn't know who these people are. Why is there more than one? What are they planning on doing, and why are they on my property? So, thinking that these people are up to no good, he goes inside, grabs his pistol, loads it up, comes back outside, and they're gone. So he looks around in either direction, where it's very open on this portion of the property, so there's really nowhere they could just turn and hide, not even in the brush, and they're just gone. Nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be found. Dennis thinks that's very odd, and after a few minutes he downs the rest of his scotch, puts his cigarette out, and decides, you know what, maybe work for me has just been too stressful. I'm going to go inside and try to go to bed. The following nights after this, both his son and daughter began to experience severe night terrors. The son having horrific nightmares of dying and being killed out in the woods, while the daughter kept experiencing what she would describe as pins and needles going up and down her spine all night, like somebody dragging needles across her skin. And on one of these nights, the son, who's 14, wakes up in the middle of the night to this dark, tall figure standing at the foot of his bed. And as soon as the boy wakes up and looks at this thing and realizes, okay, this isn't dad, this is not my family, I don't know what this thing is, it reaches down and grabs hold of his neck and almost chokes him to the point of unconsciousness, and the boy is being choked by this thing, and he's screaming for help when it just suddenly vanishes. Just gone. And at this point, he is just full-on meltdown. He doesn't know what to think. He's only 14. He's never had an experience like this before. So he goes and tells his mom Sheila and his dad, and they don't know what to think about it because they're not really believers of the paranormal. They're hardly even churchgoers. They're just a regular agnostic family. And so they kind of just write it off and explain to him, honey, you probably just had a bad dream. Just try and go back to sleep. But he refused to sleep in his bedroom again after this, and actually slept on the floor of his parents' room for the next week or two until he can gain enough trust to go back into his room again. And even then, he would refuse to sleep at all with the light off. Following this specific event, the son and daughter, whose names were never mentioned for whatever reason, began to have these strange animal claw marks appear on their backs and their forearms at random points during the day and the night. What's very strange about these claw marks is they would come and go. It's not like an actual wound in the sense of where it happens and then your body slowly heals. It's that they would appear and reappear and appear and reappear in random intervals and random times throughout the day. It didn't really make sense. But the daughter specifically claimed that they really burned when you touched them, and they weren't sure what to make of what was going on in the house. Now, coupled with all of these things going on, which is just the experience Dennis had with Luke, the experience at this point that Dennis had outside, seeing what he described as people coming towards the house, but these people were just black shapes, and then the experience that his daughter and son had, and the experience that his son had by being almost choked out by this shadow figure, the entire family, Dennis and Sheila included, began to describe and feel a strange presence lingering inside the house and around the surrounding property of the house. A strange presence that made you feel uncomfortable and unwanted. Like the second you step out of your car, you just kind of have to look around because you just feel that something is not right and you shouldn't be here. It's this heaviness lingering in the air, and they could all feel it, and it soon became the elephant in the room where nobody wanted to talk about it, but you sure as heck knew that it was there. In this chain and series of bizarre events, their family dog, a German Shepherd whom they've had for about 5 years at this point, was found dead one morning. When Dennis got up for work, he went outside to go check on his dog and found him dead right inside his kennel. Upon checking on him, he was bleeding out the mouth, eyes, and anus. Worried and figured he had gotten into poison somehow, he checked all around, but there were no signs of poison anywhere. In fact, his son is the one that usually feeds the dog, and there had been no changes at all to his diet. He had not got into anything. There was no poison at all, like snail poison or rat poison anywhere on the property. So how their dog died, complete mystery. And pretty soon, Dennis began to piece all of these strange things happening together and pointing it back at that strange elderly native man, Luke, beginning to get angry, thinking that, you know what, Luke is behind this whole thing. He's just trying to do all of this to drive my family out of here so he could selfishly take this house back. And he had gone to work this day, and the anger had just been building and stewing inside of him. And he's just been sitting there thinking about it more and more. And he's just thinking, you know what? When I get home, I'm going to call Luke. I'm going to pull out that card. I'm going to give him a call. And I'm going to give him a piece of my mind to let him know that my family is not leaving. He cannot drive us out. And he is not going to tell my family what to do. He is not going to hurt my family. He had already killed my dog. He had traumatized my son. This is all an elaborate scheme to get our family out. And he is done. So he gets home, immediately rips open the drawer, pulls out Luke's card, calls his number up. And surprisingly, Luke picks up almost immediately, and Dennis just goes off on Luke, telling him, I know it's you the one behind all these things. You're trying to drive my family out. I know you poisoned my dog. I know you set people to my property to try and scare me. I know you did some sort of prank to fool my son, telling him you're not going to fool me and I'm not going to move out of my property. And Luke simply just interrupts him and starts laughing mid-sentence with Dennis and completely cuts him off when he stops and just says, didn't I tell you what was going to happen? So Luke, completely unfazed by Dennis's angry outburst, just simply tells him, look, I'll tell you what, give me 3 days and I'll show up and we can have a nice little chit chat about taking that house off your hands and we can move forward and clear this whole thing. Dennis, still angry and now feeling mocked, just hangs up on Luke and feeling nothing but grief, anger, anxiety, and confusion over this whole ordeal between Luke and all the strange things that are going on and now the loss of their family dog. It's all too much for him right now, and he feels like he's just about to break under the pressure. The next day, he's sitting back on the porch after work, and it's just about dusk. So it's not quite sunset yet. The sun is starting to set in the sky, but it's not quite going down yet, so visibility is still very good. And he's outside again, drinking his scotch, smoking his cigarette, just trying to unwind from the day and the craziness that his career and life have brought him, when again he notices movement off to his right, out in the large area of the meadow, in the same spot where he saw the 5 or 6 figures from last time, except this time, the figures that he see were the same shapes as last, but they're going into the woods and not to his house. And immediately he's thinking, you know what, I've had enough. I'm going to follow them, and I'm going to find out what Luke told them and why they're here. Because at this point, he is convinced that Luke is orchestrating this whole spiel, and he is done. So he goes inside, he's angry, he's pissed, he's slamming stuff, he grabs his gun, he grabs his coat, he grabs his flashlight, and he's going to march off into that meadow, into the tree line, find this gang of goons, interrogate them, and find out why Luke had sent them and what their plans were. And he was going to have it end right then and there, call the police, and have Luke hopefully arrested if it worked out in Dennis's favor. He is convinced this is some big elaborate scheme or conspiracy to drive the Laurels completely away from the property so that Luke can take all of it back for whatever selfish reasons or gains that he is looking for. Dennis, who enters into the tree line, now begins to get confused because he's looking around and the woods aren't super thick, so he doesn't see any trace of anybody. So he figures, okay, well, maybe I'll just keep looking and walking and maybe I'll find these 5, 6 guys because there's not a lot of places you can hide There's not a whole lot of brush, and the trees are loosely packed together. I mean, it's kind of like a meadow, but it is more packed in. It's looser woods, really. And he'd only seen them walking into this woodline no more than 5 minutes ago, and surely they could not have gone far. And so he's thinking, you know what? They're going further back, maybe to meet Luke, so I better go further back to see if I can find them. And so he marches further back. He's still really angry, and he's looking for them, but he doesn't want to make too much noise. He wants to surprise them and then bust them. After about a quarter mile in, maybe closer to a half a mile, he sees this huge mound of stones that are in this small clearing, and for what reason he described, he just felt compelled to come to it. Like it just had some sort of lure on him to draw him closer to this mound. And as he gets closer to this rock mound, which is kind of in a smaller clearing, he notices that the air around him begins to feel different, like the atmosphere changes. It's almost as if there's a thunderstorm coming, but there were no clouds in the sky. The air felt dense. It felt like static or electricity was filling the air. It felt ominous and dark and evil, like he shouldn't have been there. The mound itself had been created by somebody, and it looked completely out of place out here. Dennis was even more baffled by how he had never noticed this mound before, and he had gone out in these 30 acres of woods past the initial 5 since having this property and even before, and never remembered there ever being a mound here, so he's baffled by this. I mean, this is a pretty large mound. It's easily probably 15 feet in diameter and maybe at least 12 to 15 feet tall of just rubble, but the feeling that was surrounding this area was so thick, was so bad, you could cut it with a knife. I mean, the tension you could feel. And within moments of just being there, Dennis began to grow increasingly ill and got so ill in that spot that he began vomiting blood. He had never felt such an eerie, evil presence than in this very spot. After vomiting blood, he began to feel even worse, like death. And he knew, I need to return home now. I'm going to abandon my mission. Just forget after trying to chase Luke and his goons. I need to get home now and lay down because I am very sick. And he began vomiting more on the way back home. And he's only about maybe a quarter mile, half a mile from the wood line, and then maybe about another 5 or so hundred yards from the house. And by the time he actually makes it back to the house, he is feeling far worse, continuously vomiting up blood, and tells his wife Sheila something is really wrong. I need you to take me to the hospital now. And so Sheila, overtaken by anxiety and fear for her husband, takes her husband to the hospital. So they get to the hospital and they do all the usual tests. They stick him with an IV, they do a blood draw, they check his levels. But after doing all these tests for a few hours, Dennis turns out to be completely fine. In fact, on paper, his health is great. He's hydrated, there's nothing wrong with him. His heart pressure is great, his heart rate is great. He doesn't seem to be under any signs of stress, but from a physical or aesthetic point of view, he's clearly very ill, continually vomiting up blood and shaking and feeling very sick, going in and out of consciousness sometimes. It was so bad. And looking at his vitals and his blood, everything checks out on paper, and so doctors are baffled by his symptoms, and they don't understand that why everything looks good on paper, but he is clearly very sick. So they decide to keep him overnight, make sure he's okay, and make sure nothing gets worse. And he does make enough progress overnight that by around midnight, they actually decide to release him and say, all right, you know what, you're good enough to go home. You're not having the severe symptoms you had when you arrived, so we're going to tell you you're okay. And so he goes home, he tries to get a good night of sleep, but even that following day, he still feels not quite right. Not as bad as puking up blood the day before, but on the verge of bedridden that he's so ill. Dennis goes throughout the remainder of the day sick as a dog, not puking anymore fortunately, but just feeling like the flu times 10. And by about the evening time, he's lying there on the couch, just feeling awful when there's a knock on the door. And so Sheila and Dennis look at each other, confused and totally having forgotten all about the whole Luke conversation a few days before, and telling Dennis and them that he would show up 3 days from now. Sheila, confused, goes and opens the door, and sure enough, it's their favorite person, Luke, who kindly just greets her, tips his hat off, and just inserts himself into the house and saying, how are you guys doing? He stops almost mid-step, looks at Dennis right in the eyes, and his happy, upbeat expression turns cold and serious, and looks at him so strongly in the eyes and says, you should have never gone back there. Dennis, completely baffled and shaken by his tone and the seriousness in his voice doesn't even know how to respond. Instead, Dennis goes on the same old tripe again, how this is all Luke's fault, and that this is Luke's plan to somehow poison the dog, poison him, get rid of his family, yada yada yada. You've been hearing the same spool the entire episode. And Luke cuts Dennis off and just chuckles at him and explains to him, look, you can make these accusations all you want, but I'm going to restate what I already told you the first time we spoke. The spirits are getting angry and they are growing very impatient. You don't have a lot of time left. You got to make a decision now. They will not stop coming for you. Either your family is going to die or you're going to leave. One of those things is going to happen first. You need to decide which. But Dennis is as stubborn as a mule and refuses to hear any of it and thinks at this point, I am about done with Luke's nonsense. He tells him off, tells him to go leave now or he's going to call the police. And Luke is just baffled by this. Luke does not understand why Dennis is just so obstinate and not taking into consideration anything Luke has to say. So his tone goes back to serious. He just nods in understanding, steps out the door, looks back at Sheila, nods, looks back at Dennis, nods, and just says, I'm sorry it had to be this way, and walks off, and he's gone. And as soon as Luke had left the property, things take a very dark twist for the Laurel family. Dennis has had enough. Sheila is unsure what to make of all this, but she's very bothered. She's a pretty quiet person, so she's not really outspoken about her opinions and beliefs. That night, once everybody had gone to bed, Dennis, who was sound asleep, woke up to Sheila, his wife, screaming bloody murder, and so he jumps up out of bed, looks at Sheila, who's looking out their bedroom window outside. He's still feeling very under the weather, so he kind of hobbles over to the window to see what she's screaming bloody murder at, and what he sees terrifies him. He sees those same people, what he saw a couple days previously going into the woodline, and originally coming out of the woodline. About 10 or 15 of these people, there's no features, these are just human silhouettes that are black, just slowly approaching the house, step by step by step, taking their time, walking from the direction of the woodline as before, but this time they are much closer to the house. And with Sheila still screaming, Dennis goes into action mode. He is panicked, but he realizes, you know what, I gotta go grab my pistol and I gotta protect my family. So he gets his pants on quickly and he runs over to his liquor cabinet, rips it open, pulls out his gun, loads it, runs back to the window, and they're getting closer and they're getting closer. And he hears this violent, horrible screaming coming from his son's room. Completely panicked, he gets up and he runs down the hall to his son's room, opens the door, and his son is there on the bed, shaking and having seizures, and his eyes are rolling in the back of his head and he's screaming. And so he drops his gun, runs over to his son, picks him up, and he's looking at his son who's just shaking violently and having seizures, is what he described, with foam coming out of his mouth and just his eyes rolling in the back of his head. And he's screaming at his son, and he's screaming at his son, making sure his son is still here, when all of a sudden his son just stops. His eyes roll back and they are completely black. And his face had completely changed from his son's to something else. And immediately, the son just starts laughing and telling him in a voice that was not his son to let them in, let them in. It's time, let them in. Dennis stumbles back in fear, runs out of his bedroom, and hears his daughter now screaming. I don't think this is something that I would have personally done being in Dennis's situation, but I guess I have to try and put myself in his shoes and realize that under his mind frame at the time, in this very moment, he was probably under a very tremendous amount of stress and a very tumultuous situation. I can't even imagine how you'd even react or feel in a situation like this. My only assumption is that he is not thinking clearly, so he runs to his daughter's room, but she's nowhere to be found. She's gone, even though he had just heard her screaming. And so he's thinking, I gotta go find my wife. We gotta get out of here. So he runs back downstairs and he opens the door to his wife, and she is unconscious on the floor. And keep in mind, these figures have not stopped. These people or things or whatever they are continuing to get closer and closer and closer to the house, ever so slowly. And so Dennis runs over to his wife, picks her up off the floor, and she's out cold. She is out cold. Luckily, she's still breathing. I mean, she's alive, but she's just completely unresponsive. Dennis has no idea what to even do at this point. What is going on? This is all far beyond his realm of comprehension and understanding. He gets up, runs over to the hallway, grabs his gun off the hallway floor, runs out to the porch, and starts firing shots off at all of these things, screaming, "Leave my family alone! Leave him alone! I've had enough!" but the bullets aren't doing anything. They're just passing right through these shadows, so to speak. The very last thing we know about this night is that these beings or entities get inside the house. Police Officer Fitzgerald, name changed for the sake of the story, had arrived at the Laurel residence in the early morning hours at 9:09 a.m. after receiving a disturbing 911 call of a woman screaming in the background for about 5 seconds and then cut out to static. This alerted 911, obviously, is a very dangerous situation. They had sent 3 officers to the scene, figuring this could either be a dangerous, violent situation, a potential hostage situation. So they had sent Officer Fitzgerald, Officer Harrison, and Officer Gagliotti to arrive on the scene. What the police found would greatly disturb all 3 officers, whom they couldn't make sense of anything they found. Upon arriving at the scene, the first thing they noticed was, due to the call and the nature of the call, and the condition the house was in, the family car was left completely intact. Nothing wrong with it, it was still there. Nobody had left the property at all. However, all the first-story windows surrounding the house were completely shattered, and shattered from the outside in, meaning someone or something broke every window to get in the house. All 3 officers began to call out outside and into the house where the police were here. If there's anybody here, let us know, call out, but they heard nothing. And as soon as they got into the house, the front door was open. They noticed, all 3 of them by the way, noted how cold the house was, and outside it was warmer, considering this was in the summertime, and just how icy cold the house was despite having any air conditioning. So cold you could see your breath. The house was a disaster. Furniture flipped over, windows shattered. It looked like a bar fight had gone on and exploded inside the house. But there were no blood trails or any obvious signs of a murder or anything that they would suspect as foul play. It just looked like somebody had broken in. After calling out and looking all around the house, they found nobody. They didn't see anybody. However, towards the back section of the house, sitting right by the basement door, was Dennis. Almost completely naked, covered head to toe in blood, sitting there curled up in the fetal position on the floor, shaking and rocking himself, muttering gibberish. When they had found him, they tried to talk to him, but he was completely unresponsive and would not even make eye contact. They even shined a light in his eye and tried to get him to respond, but he was gone. He was mentally gone. So they handcuffed him, they detained him, they took him in. There was tests done on the blood on his body, which did not turn out to be his wife, his daughter, or his son. They could not find out whose blood it was, and it was not his either. They began trying to question him and find out, where's your family? Where did they go? Why are they gone? Where did they go to? But Dennis was so mentally gone, he could not even comprehend English and questions, so he had to go into psych care in the hospital. After some time, he came to enough. He was still very mentally unstable, but he came to enough to, in depth, tell the officers and detectives exactly what had transpired from the very beginning of moving in to the events that we had just gotten to right at this point in the story. And the last thing he claimed that he remembered was shooting at these people and then falling unconscious or blacking out. That's the last thing he remembers. The 2 detectives who were working on this case were completely in denial of what he had to say and did not believe his story at all. And they believed that Dennis had murdered the family, did something with their bodies, and he was behind all of this, that he had staged some large, elaborate, supernatural story to try and get off murder. And judging by how mentally unstable he was, even though looking at his past history, he showed no signs of mental illness, they were convinced that he was a closet schizophrenic and somehow he had just got lost in the throes of a bad schizo episode and went off and murdered his entire family in an anger tangent. These 2 detectives were convinced they were going to find out the keys they needed to put Dennis away for life and prove he murdered the entire family and the dog. But as it turns out, within days of interrogating Dennis, both detectives were let go from the force, and in the days following that, both would disappear. Dennis, very shortly after this, was taken from the hospital by an unknown man to an unknown location, and that was the last there was ever any sign of Dennis, and his current whereabouts are completely unknown. The elderly native man, Luke, who had just said that he lived right down the road, and because Luke never existed on paper and did not match any descriptions or any location to where Dennis had pointed them to, they were convinced that Dennis had made up this character Luke in his schizophrenic mind as an incentive to murder his entire family, and was another part of the reason they were going to find the keys to lock him away for good and prove that he did indeed murder his dog and his entire family. But after they got let go and they 2 disappeared, it made the case all the more mysterious. And then just shortly thereafter, an unknown individual coming into the hospital, releasing and somehow having the authority to release Dennis and taking him to an unknown location is very strange, where we have no idea who Dennis is or where he is today. The Laurel family and just about every single piece of documentation surrounding the entire case, the 2 detectives, the officers that worked on the case, and the entire family has either been destroyed or deeply classified, all in some large attempt or conspiracy to hide the truth. For what reason? I personally don't know, but I believe that because this case had supernatural qualities to it, it might be why. Obtaining this information, I was told by my intel, was extremely difficult and took a lot of digging, and that there are hundreds of other families who've experienced something very similar, just as this, and their voices will never be heard, unfortunately, because for whatever reason, the government and law enforcement has decided to permanently silence them. While this story is entertaining, it also serves as a remembrance and respect to the Laurel family. That's going to do it for today's episode, you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and smack that subscribe button, hit the like button, and leave a comment below, and you'll see a lot of great content coming from me really soon. I got a bunch of cool stuff coming in the pipeline. Stay tuned.